August 7, 1942 marked the day when hell descended upon Guadalcanal. The morning sun barely crested the horizon when the first wave of United States Marines stormed Red Beach, their boots hitting volcanic sand with a determination that would reshape the entire Pacific theater. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were men forged in the brutal crucible of Marine Corps training, warriors who carried a legacy stretching back to the battlefields of Belleau Wood in the First World War, where German soldiers had first whispered their name in fearful reverence. Teufel the Devil Dogs. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Austin Edson stood among his raiders that morning, his weathered face betraying no emotion as explosions erupted across the shoreline. Around him, young Marines clutched their M1 Garand rifles, their knuckles white against dark metal. They had trained for 18 months in sweltering camps across California and Hawaii, learning to fight in jungles, to navigate impossible terrain, and to never, ever retreat. The Imperial Japanese Army controlled nearly every strategic point from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands, their soldiers indoctrinated with the Bushido code that death was preferable to surrender. But the Marines brought their own code, one equally uncompromising. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. The Japanese defenders, members of the elite Special Naval Landing Forces, watched from concealed positions along the tree line. According to captured documents later analyzed by Marine Corps historians and referenced in numerous wartime reports, including those compiled by the United States Naval Institute, these soldiers had been assured of their invincibility. They had conquered Singapore, humiliated British forces, and pushed American troops out of the Philippines. Yet as they observed the methodical advance of the Marines that August morning, something unprecedented occurred. The Americans did not break under artillery fire. They did not scatter when machine guns opened up from hidden bunkers. Instead, they pressed forward with a mechanical ruthlessness that defied every tactical expectation. Private First Class Robert Leckie, whose memoir would later provide crucial insights into the Marine experience, hit the beach with the 1st Marine Division. The smell of cordite and salt water filled his nostrils as he scrambled across the sand, seeking cover behind a fallen palm log. Around him, men he had trained with for over a year moved with practiced precision, their squad leaders directing fire with hand signals learned through endless repetition. This was not the chaotic scramble that Japanese intelligence had predicted. This was organized violence, delivered with industrial efficiency. By nightfall of that first day, over 11,000 Marines had established a perimeter on Guadalcanal. They had seized the partially completed Japanese airfield that would soon be renamed Henderson Field in honor of a fallen aviator. More critically, they had demonstrated something that would echo across every subsequent island battle in the Pacific. The United States Marine Corps would not be stopped by conventional defensive tactics, no matter how fanatically defended. The Japanese High Command, studying reports from survivors, began to realize they faced an enemy unlike any they had encountered. These Marines fought with a combination of technological superiority, tactical flexibility, and sheer determination that challenged every assumption about American fighting spirit. As darkness fell over that contested island, both sides prepared for the grinding battle ahead, neither fully understanding that Guadalcanal would become the proving ground where the Marine Corps would forge its legend as the most feared amphibious force in military history. September 12, 1942 brought rain and death to Guadalcanal in equal measure. The jungle canopy dripped with moisture as Colonel Merritt Edson gathered his raider battalion along a ridgeline that would forever bear his name. Intelligence reports, fragmentary and often contradictory, suggested a major Japanese offensive was imminent. What those reports failed to convey was the scale of determination driving the Imperial forces. Over 3,000 soldiers of the Kawaguchi Brigade had spent days infiltrating through the dense jungle, surviving on handfuls of rice, driven by orders from General Harukichi Hyakutake to annihilate the American invaders at any cost. The Marines had spent weeks transforming from ship-bound warriors into jungle fighters. They learned to listen for the subtle sounds that preceded an ambush, the sudden silence of birds, the rustle of vegetation that moved against the wind. They learned to fight in darkness so complete that soldiers literally could not see their hands before their faces. Most crucially, they learned to trust the man beside them with absolute certainty. In the Marine Corps, this was not merely encouraged. It was fundamental to survival. As night descended on Edson's Ridge, the Japanese attacked with a ferocity that stunned even veteran Marines. Wave after wave of soldiers charged up the slopes, screaming battle cries, hurling grenades, firing knee mortar that erupted in orange flashes across the hillside. The Marines, dug into hastily prepared positions, poured fire downslope with their Browning automatic rifles and machine guns. The noise was apocalyptic, a continuous roar of explosions and rifle fire that shredded the jungle vegetation and the men moving through it. Corporal Mitchell Page, commanding a machine gun section, witnessed his entire crew killed around him during the second night of battle. Rather than retreat, he manned his weapon alone, firing until the barrel glowed red-hot, changing barrels with his bare hands despite severe burns. When his ammunition ran low, he hauled the 30-pound machine gun from its mount and carried it forward, firing from the hip as he led a counterattack that drove the Japanese back down the ridge. His actions that night would earn him the Medal of Honor, but more importantly, they exemplified the Marine Corps' ethos that surrender was simply not an option. The Japanese soldiers, many of them veterans of campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, had never encountered resistance like this. Their tactical doctrine assumed that determined infantry assaults, particularly at night, would overwhelm American positions through sheer aggression and willingness to accept casualties. This had worked against Chinese forces and British colonial troops. It failed catastrophically against the Marines. American defensive positions featured interlocking fields of fire, pre-registered artillery coordinates, and communications networks that allowed rapid reinforcement of threatened sectors. The Marines did not simply absorb attacks, they systematically destroyed them. By dawn on September 14th, the slopes of Edson's Ridge were carpeted with Japanese dead. The Kawaguchi Brigade, once a proud formation of over 3,000 men, had been shattered. Fewer than 1,000 would make it back to their lines. The Marines, though exhausted and depleted, held their positions. They had discovered something profound about themselves and taught the Japanese a terrible lesson. According to historical analyses later published in military journals, including detailed studies by the Marine Corps' Historical Division, the battle demonstrated that American forces could match and exceed Japanese fighting spirit when properly led and equipped. Colonel Edson, surveying the carnage as morning light revealed the true scale of the slaughter, understood that this battle represented a turning point. The myth of Japanese invincibility had died on this ridge. The Marines had proven they could defeat elite enemy forces in close combat under the worst possible conditions. Word of this victory spread rapidly through both military establishments, but its impact on Japanese morale proved particularly significant. For the first time, doubt crept into the minds of soldiers who had been taught they were racially and spiritually superior warriors. November 1st, 1943 witnessed the beginning of Operation Galvanic. The assault on Tarawa Atoll, this tiny strip of coral in the Gilbert Islands, barely 2 miles long and nowhere more than 800 yards wide, represented everything that made the Marines the most feared amphibious force in the Pacific. The Japanese had transformed Betio Island into a fortress, pouring concrete, steel, and thousands of naval mines into defenses that Admiral Kiji Shibasaki boldly claimed could not be taken by 1,000,000 men in 100 years. The 2nd Marine Division was about to prove him catastrophically wrong, though the price would be measured in blood. Major General Julian Smith commanded the operation from the battleship Maryland. Watching through binoculars as his Marines climbed into their amphibious tractors, the newly deployed LVTs that would theoretically carry them over the coral reef to the beaches. The pre-invasion bombardment had been the most intensive in the Pacific War to that point, with battleships and cruisers firing thousands of shells at the tiny island. Smoke and coral dust obscured everything as the first wave began its run toward shore. What the Marines could not know was that the bombardment, impressive as it appeared, had barely scratched the Japanese defenses built from coconut logs and reinforced concrete. The battle that followed shocked the American public and provided Imperial forces with a false hope that perhaps the Marine advance could be stopped. At beaches designated Red 1, Red 2, and Red 3, Marines encountered devastating fire from positions that had survived the bombardment. Their LVTs struggled over the reef, some breaking down, others taking direct hits from artillery. Men jumped into chest-deep water, holding their rifles over their heads, wading toward a beach swept by machine gun fire. The water turned red. Bodies floated among the coral. Yet the Marines continued advancing. Staff Sergeant William Bourdillon, an engineer with the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, exemplified the Marine Corps' spirit that so terrified Japanese defenders. Despite being wounded multiple times, he repeatedly charged Japanese pillboxes with demolition charges, destroying 4 fortified positions before being killed while attacking a 5th. His actions opened gaps in the defenses that allowed other Marines to push inland. Across all 3 beaches, similar acts of courage occurred dozens, perhaps hundreds of times. Individual Marines, often wounded, facing impossible odds, simply refused to stop fighting. The Japanese defenders fought with equal determination, but they faced a fundamental problem that would plague them throughout the island campaigns. The Marines did not fight as individuals seeking glory or death. They fought as an integrated system. When one squad was pinned down, another maneuvered to flank the position. When a company commander fell, his executive officer immediately took command. Artillery forward observers, often exposed to direct fire, called in devastating barrages that shattered Japanese counterattacks. Navy corpsmen, the medical personnel attached to Marine units, repeatedly ran into fire to drag wounded men to safety. By the evening of the 3rd day, November 23rd, Bedio had fallen. Over 4,500 Japanese defenders lay dead, with only 17 taken prisoner, most of them Korean laborers. The Marines suffered over 3,000 casualties, including more than 1,000 dead. The brutality of the fighting shocked Americans back home when combat footage was released. But within the Japanese military, Tarawa confirmed a growing fear. The Marines could not be stopped by static defenses, no matter how formidable. They would pay any price, absorb any level of casualties, to achieve their objectives. Japanese tactical documents captured later in the war, analyzed extensively by American intelligence and later by historians, revealed a shift in defensive thinking after Tarawa. Orders began emphasizing defense in depth, using the terrain itself rather than beach defenses. This represented an acknowledgement that meeting the Marines at the waterline meant destruction. The only hope was to bleed them inland, to make every yard so costly that perhaps, eventually, the American public would demand an end to the slaughter. It was a strategy born of desperation and grudging respect for an enemy that simply would not stop coming. January 1, 1944 found the Marine Corps undergoing a transformation unlike any in its history. Training facilities from Camp Pendleton in California to Camp Lejeune in North Carolina processed thousands of recruits monthly, each man subjected to a regimen designed to strip away civilian softness and rebuild them as Marines. The training was deliberately brutal, physically and mentally exhausting, because the battles ahead would demand nothing less than perfection under conditions of unimaginable stress. The Marine Corps' doctrine that so confounded Japanese planners rested on several revolutionary principles. First, amphibious assault was treated as a science, not simply a military operation. Every aspect, from naval gunfire support to air coordination to logistics, was studied, refined, and practiced until it became second nature. Second, the Marines emphasized combined arms warfare, integrating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support in ways that multiplied their effective combat power. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Marine Corps' culture demanded that every man, regardless of specialty, was fundamentally a rifleman trained to close with and destroy the enemy. Lieutenant General Holland McTire Smith, commanding all Marine forces in the Central Pacific, understood that future operations would require even greater coordination and firepower. The battles at Guadalcanal and Tarawa had revealed both the strengths and limitations of Marine tactics. His staff, working from headquarters in Hawaii, developed detailed plans for upcoming operations against the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, and eventually Japan itself. These plans assumed fierce resistance and high casualties, but they also incorporated lessons learned from previous battles. Japanese military intelligence, meanwhile, struggled to understand what made the Marines so effective. Interrogations of captured Marines, though rare given the intense fighting and high casualty rates on both sides, revealed men who showed no particular enthusiasm for dying but demonstrated absolute confidence in their training and their comrades. This contradicted Japanese propaganda that portrayed Americans as soft, individualistic, and lacking warrior spirit. The reality was far more troubling for imperial planners. The Marines fought with cold, calculated efficiency, their aggression tempered by discipline and superior logistics. The weapons and equipment available to Marines in 1944 represented a significant advantage. The M1 Garand rifle, semi-automatic and reliable even in jungle conditions, provided superior firepower compared to the Japanese Type 38 bolt-action rifle. The Browning automatic rifle gave each squad devastating suppressive fire capability. Marine artillery, particularly the versatile 105mm howitzer, delivered responsive, accurate fire support that could shatter Japanese defensive positions within minutes. Perhaps most crucially, American logistics ensured that Marines rarely faced the ammunition shortages and food scarcity that plagued Japanese forces. Yet equipment alone did not explain Marine effectiveness. The critical factor was institutional culture. From the moment a recruit arrived at boot camp, he was indoctrinated with Marine Corps' history and values. He learned about Below Wood, Guadalcanal, and Tarawa not as abstract historical events, but as part of an unbroken tradition he was now joining. He learned that Marines do not abandon their wounded or their dead. He learned that impossible orders were simply orders that required greater effort. He learned that his reputation, his honor, and his life depended on the man to his left and right, and theirs depended on him. This cultural foundation created formations that could sustain casualties that would shatter most military units and continue fighting effectively. At Tarawa, entire companies had been reduced to a handful of men, yet they reorganized, absorbed replacements, and continued the attack. Japanese soldiers, observing this resilience through rifle sights and artillery observations, began to understand they faced an enemy that could not be defeated through attrition alone. Some Japanese after-action reports, captured in subsequent battles and translated by Marine intelligence, described the Americans as possessing a form of collective madness, an inability to recognize when they were beaten. In reality, the Marines simply had better training, better support, and a culture that demanded victory regardless of cost. September 15, 1944 brought the 1st Marine Division back to combat after months of rest and refitting in Australia. Their target was Peleliu, a small island in the Palau chain that American planners believed necessary for future operations against the Philippines. Intelligence estimates suggested the island could be secured in 4 days. The Marines would fight for over 2 months in what many veterans considered the most brutal battle of the entire Pacific War. Colonel Lewis Burwell Puller, known throughout the Marine Corps as Chesty Puller, commanded the 1st Marine Regiment during the landing. At age 46, he was old for combat command, his body already, carrying wounds from earlier battles and from service in Haiti and Nicaragua during the Banana Wars of the 1920s and 30s. But Puller embodied Marine Corps' values so completely that his mere presence boosted morale. His philosophy was simple: lead from the front, share every hardship with your men, and never ask them to do anything you would not do yourself. The Japanese defenders on Peleliu, approximately 10,000 men under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had learned from previous island battles. Rather than defending the beaches and dying under naval bombardment, they had transformed the island's central ridges into a fortress. Hundreds of caves, many interconnected by tunnels, sheltered troops and supplies. Artillery and mortar were positioned in positions where they could fire and then withdraw into the caves before counter-battery fire arrived. It was defense in depth taken to its ultimate expression, and it would cost the Marines dearly. The landing itself went relatively smoothly, with Marines pushing inland against lighter resistance than expected. Then they encountered the ridges. Coral limestone formations rose hundreds of feet, their surfaces torn into jagged peaks and fissures by ancient geological forces and recent Japanese engineering. Every cave mouth concealed machine guns or artillery. Approaches were covered by interlocking fields of fire. The coral absorbed artillery shells, and the caves provided protection from naval gunfire and aerial bombardment. The Marines would have to dig the Japanese out one position at a time. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, whose memoir With the Old Breed would become one of the most powerful accounts of Pacific combat, experienced Peleliu as a newly arrived replacement. He witnessed the physical and psychological destruction the battle inflicted on both attackers and defenders. The heat was overwhelming, with temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Water was scarce, strictly rationed. The coral surface offered no protection, forcing Marines to use explosives to blast shallow fighting positions. The smell of death, human waste, and rotting vegetation permeated everything. Men fought in these conditions day after day, week after week, until exhaustion became a physical presence as real as the enemy. Marine tactics evolved during the Peleliu fighting. Standard infantry assaults against fortified cave positions proved suicidally expensive. Instead, Marine engineers developed techniques using flamethrowers, demolition charges, and direct fire from Sherman tanks to systematically reduce each position. A typical attack might involve Marines providing covering fire while a flamethrower team approached a cave entrance. After saturating the cave with burning fuel, engineers would seal the entrance with explosives. It was methodical, brutal work that required courage measured in feet rather than miles. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was profound. Soldiers who had been told they were fighting for the emperor and the honor of Japan found themselves trapped in caves, slowly being incinerated or buried alive, with no hope of reinforcement or relief. Some chose to conduct suicidal banzai charges rather than endure the slow death of siege warfare. Others simply waited in the darkness, knowing the Marines would eventually come. According to post-war interviews with surviving Japanese soldiers, conducted by American military historians and documented in official records, many expressed surprise not at Marine courage, which they expected, but at Marine persistence. The Americans simply would not stop, would not slow down, would not accept any outcome except complete Japanese destruction. By November 27th, when the island was finally declared secure, the 1st Marine Division had suffered over 60% casualties. The victory had taken 2 months instead of 4 days. Yet the Marines had proven once again that Japanese defensive positions, no matter how formidable, could be overcome. For the Japanese military, Peleliu represented a Pyrrhic success at best. They had inflicted terrible casualties and delayed the American advance, but they had not stopped it. The lesson was clear: the Marines would go wherever they were ordered, no matter the cost, and they would ultimately prevail through superior firepower, logistics, and institutional determination. June 15, 1944 marked the beginning of Operation Forager, the assault on Saipan in the Mariana Islands. This operation represented a strategic nightmare for Japan because successful capture of the Marianas would place American B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The political and military leadership in Tokyo understood that losing Saipan meant losing the war, and they committed substantial forces to its defense. Over 30,000 Japanese troops, including the 43rd Division and elements of the 31st Army, occupied the island's mountainous terrain and coastal defenses. The landings involved both the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, over 70,000 men in total, in what was then the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific. The pre-invasion bombardment lasted 3 days, with battleships, cruisers, and carrier aircraft pounding Japanese positions. Yet, when the first waves of Marines hit the beaches, they encountered devastating fire from artillery positions that had survived the bombardment. The Japanese had learned to conceal their guns in caves and reinforced positions, withholding fire until the beaches were crowded with men and vehicles. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the 4th Marine Division, watched the landings from his command ship and immediately recognized the operation was in trouble. Japanese fire from the high ground overlooking the beaches was shredding his formations. He made a crucial decision. Rather than pausing to reorganize, he ordered follow-on waves to continue landing and push inland immediately. This created chaos on the beaches but prevented the Japanese from containing the invasion at the waterline. By nightfall, over 20,000 Marines had pushed inland, establishing a perimeter that, while precarious, provided space for additional forces to land. The Battle of Saipan lasted 3 weeks and showcased every aspect of Marine Corps' capabilities. Infantry units pushed through sugarcane fields and up volcanic ridges against determined resistance. Tank battalions, now equipped with improved Sherman tanks mounting 75mm guns, provided mobile firepower that destroyed Japanese strongpoints. Artillery battalions displaced forward repeatedly, maintaining continuous fire support. Naval gunfire, coordinated by forward observers who often worked within yards of enemy positions, delivered devastating bombardments that broke up Japanese counterattacks before they could develop momentum. The psychological pressure on Japanese forces was immense. Many soldiers were recent conscripts with minimal training, unlike the veteran forces that had defended Guadalcanal and Tarawa. They watched the endless procession of American ships bringing supplies, reinforcements, and equipment. They witnessed the coordination between Marine ground forces, Navy vessels, and Army Air Force's bombers that struck Japanese positions with terrifying precision. Most demoralizing, they saw that every Marine who fell was replaced, every destroyed vehicle was replaced, every expended shell was replaced. The Americans possessed resources that seemed limitless. On July 7th, Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo and Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Sato, commanding Japanese forces on Saipan, recognized the battle was lost. Rather than surrender, they ordered a final banzai charge, the largest of the Pacific War. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors, many armed only with bamboo spears or grenades, attacked American positions in a desperate attempt to die honorably rather than face capture. The Marines, supported by Army units that had joined the battle, held their positions and systematically destroyed the attackers. The slaughter was immense, traumatizing even for veterans who had seen years of combat. The fall of Saipan had immediate consequences. In Tokyo, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government fell, forced to resign by an emperor and military leadership that recognized the strategic disaster. More than 46,000 Japanese defenders died on Saipan, with fewer than 1,000 taken prisoner. The Marines suffered over 13,000 casualties, including over 3,000 killed. But they had secured the island and demonstrated once again that Japanese forces, regardless of defensive advantages or numerical strength, could not stop the Marine advance. According to military historians and contemporary analyses, published in journals like the United States Naval Institute Proceedings, the Marianas Campaign represented the moment when Japanese military planners finally accepted that defeating the Marines in conventional battle was impossible. The only remaining question was how much damage Japan could inflict before inevitable defeat. February 19, 1945, witnessed the beginning of perhaps the most iconic battle in Marine Corps' history. Iwo Jima, a volcanic island 8 square miles in size, sat 660 miles south of Tokyo. Its strategic value was immense. Japanese fighters based there intercepted American bombers attacking the home islands, while conversely, if captured, the island would provide an emergency landing field for damaged bombers and a base for fighter escorts. The Japanese recognized Iwo Jima's importance and garrisoned it with over 21,000 troops under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Korebayashi, perhaps the most capable defensive commander Japan fielded during the war. Korebayashi had studied American tactics extensively and designed his defense specifically to counter Marine capabilities. He abandoned the traditional approach of defending beaches and instead created a defense in depth centered on Mount Suribachi, the volcano dominating the island's southern tip, and a complex of fortifications across the northern plateau. His soldiers constructed hundreds of pillboxes, blockhouses, and artillery positions connected by 11 miles of tunnels. They stockpiled ammunition and supplies for a protracted siege. Most importantly, Korebayashi forbade banzai charges, ordering his men to inflict maximum casualties on the Americans while conserving their forces for as long as possible. The 3 Marine divisions that assaulted Iwo Jima, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, represented the largest Marine force ever committed to a single operation. The pre-invasion bombardment lasted 3 days but proved inadequate against the deeply buried Japanese fortifications. When the first waves hit the beaches, they encountered black volcanic sand that vehicles could not traverse and that offered no cover. Japanese artillery and mortar, firing from camouflaged positions, turned the beaches into killing grounds. Within minutes, the carefully planned landing schedule dissolved into chaos. Yet the Marines adapted with a speed that stunned Japanese observers. Combat engineers bulldozed paths through the sand, allowing tanks and artillery to move inland. Infantry units, taking horrific casualties, pushed forward yard by yard, using flamethrowers and demolition charges to reduce each Japanese position. Navy corpsmen worked under fire to treat the wounded, often becoming casualties themselves. The Marines' institutional experience, accumulated over 3 years of Pacific combat, manifested in countless small unit actions where sergeants and corporals made tactical decisions that kept the advance moving. The raising of the American flag atop Mount Suribachi on February 23 became one of the war's most enduring images, photographed by Joe Rosenthal and later immortalized in sculpture. But that moment, powerful as it was symbolically, came only 4 days into a battle that would last 36 days. The fighting for the northern plateau proved even more brutal than the initial landings. Japanese defenders occupied positions that were nearly invisible until Marines came within grenade range. Every yard gained cost casualties. Medical facilities quickly overflowed with wounded.